Hello YouTube. Skyrim is full of cool and interesting creatures, from the creepy Chaurus to the annoying Spriggan. Now, with the Elder Scrolls lore being as deep as it is, it should not come as a surprise that most of these creatures have a pretty deep story of their own. And we even have lore on creatures that should be in Skyrim according to the lore, but just aren't. And over the years I covered the lore of many of these creatures on the channel. So today I edited all of that lore together into this one big long form lore video on Skyrim's creatures and monsters for you to enjoy, and of course with timestamps in case you want to jump to a certain creature or skip a certain section. So join me as today we'll recap the lore of many of Skyrim's creatures and even talk about some of the creatures that should be in Skyrim but were either left out or cut during development. And we're starting with probably Skyrim's most common enemy in the dungeons, the Draugr. So, the Draugr, undead creatures roaming the ancient tombs of Skyrim, one of the game's most recognizable enemies. In the lore they are described as skeletons raised and wrapped around transparent flesh, rags of leather half rotted away, and helms from another age, many horned and all of fine craftsmanship, adorning some of the tougher, heavily armored Draugr. Pale blue, lifeless eyes bathed in eerie mist, hovering in black sockets. Pretty creepy. But these undead are not just zombies, rather they are followers of an ancient cult given eternal life, although it's an eternal life of servitude and without free will. Let me explain. Several thousands of years before the events of Skyrim, before the First Era even began, the ancestors of the modern day Nords worshipped the dragons as gods in what was known as the dragon cult. I talked about that in depth in a different video and about their beliefs, which I'll put in the description in case you want to check out their beliefs. But in short, these humans believed that the dragons deserved to rule over humanity like gods, deserving the humans' eternal worship in return for several boons and in some cases eternal life. Now, the dragons themselves weren't really too interested in the details of ruling the masses. They enjoyed the symbolism of being humanity's god rulers, but they didn't want to concern themselves too much with details. So they appointed certain mortal humans as their representatives to humanity, forming a special bond with these individuals who would don masks and then speak with the dragon's authority and rule on their behalf. These individuals were the dragon priests, who in some cases had more power than kings among the early Nordic society. Now, the interesting thing here is that the dragon cult back in the day had access to some pretty advanced magical necromantic rituals, which were the techniques used to create the Draugr and preserve the dragon priests up until the modern day. You see, you can't really talk about the Draugr without talking about the dragon priests, as while there are two different types of undead, with the dragon priest being a type of lich created from ancient Nordic necromancy, they're explicitly linked with the Draugr. You see, the eternal life promised to some of the followers of the dragon cult came at a price for most regular cultists, specifically the seeming loss of free will and eternal servitude, work and worship in service to the dragon priest. Now, these dragon priests, they got a significantly better deal, as they got turned into undead liches, and they seem to have retained some form of free will, even though it's suggested that they may also be chained to Alduin's will in some way, but that's a topic for another day. The important thing to understand is that back in the day, these dragon priests, when they were in power, had elaborate tombs built for themselves for the time in which they would be turned into a lich to gain eternal life. They would be buried in these tombs alongside their followers, who would be turned into the Draugr and who would lose their free will and be forced to rise from the dead. Now, when they were risen from the dead, or some form of eternal magical sleep, they worshipped the dragon priest, they cleaned the tombs and protect the tombs from intruders, and also transfer life energy to the dragon priest. You see, we have several lore books mentioning how the Draugr go to the dragon priest's coffin to worship the coffin, and the priest within, with an energy transfer taking place from the Draugr to the priest. An important note here is that apparently in almost every tomb in the lore there is some form of dragon priest interred. I know that especially at earlier levels there are some higher level Draugr in like the final coffin of a dungeon, but in the lore there are apparently all forms of dragon priests, at least most of them. Now, this worship and this energy transfer that happens from the Draugr to the person in the coffin happens in some sort of shifts, with different sets of Draugr waking up every day from this magical sleep-like death to transfer energy to the Dragon Priest, and then also clean the tomb and worship the coffin. Why exactly they do this, we don't really know. I imagine that the Dragon Priest requires it somehow to sustain its lich form of eternal life, but we don't know exactly what's going on with this energy transfer. Interestingly enough, despite them being trapped in an eternal servitude to their priest, the Draugr seem to have retained some intelligence, not much, but definitely more intelligence than your average zombie, because despite in-universe scholars describing Draugr as having only the barest whisper of life, the Draugr are still able to speak in the dragon language, and they seem to have some sort of mental hive mind intelligence that allows them to coordinate themselves in groups around the tomb, and it's likely that the Dragon Priest in its coffin is somehow at the center of this sort of hive mind they seem to have, although we don't have any concrete lore on how this works exactly, nor the word hive mind. I just found that to be the most accurate word to describe what we have. We just know that they are able to coordinate thoughts between them somehow and alter behaviors as groups, in combination with the fact that they have some sort of mystical connection to their Dragon Priest, so the word hive mind seemed the most logical explanation. Now, most modern-day Tamrielic scholars seem to speculate that the eternal servitude and loss of free will seem to be some sort of punishment from the Age of the Dragons. But that doesn't really seem to be the case, because from some surviving dragon cult sources we learn that, at least in their theology and propaganda, it said that the Dragon Priest's most dedicated followers freely gave their eternal service as a sacrifice to their faith, and by the most dedicated worshippers, having yourself be turned into a Draugr was apparently seen as the purest form of worship, as it's an eternal, unbreakable life promise to your faith. They also cannot stray too far from their tombs, it seems, as it seems that their servitude somehow binds them to their tombs and to their priests. Now, something really interesting here is that we have some sources saying that the Draugr, before being buried in the tombs alongside their masters, went through a partial mummification process, with many of their internal organs being removed before being put in the tombs for servitude, as to preserve their bodies for a longer time and to prevent internal rot, which would make them less effective long-term servants, and which is why we see most of them still having skin, despite having been buried millennia ago. We even have an in-universe scholar speculating that when they were buried, the Draugr looked just like regular humans, just with an eerie blue glow in their eyes and no free will, and that it took thousands of years of degradation for them to become the way that they are now. An interesting bit of speculation here is that this may have even meant that back when the dragon cult was active and alive and the priests still ruled, some dragon priests may have ruled the cults from their tombs, where they already had their servants already made into Draugr, but just looking like regular humans, which then served them in their lich bodies already while they were still ruling, while living humans were also still visiting their tombs, or rather palace-like tombs, in the days of the dragon cult, making for some pretty creepy government buildings. I mean, imagine going to petition the local dragon priest for some new goats or whatever because your neighbor stole them, and just having to go through this palace-like tomb where people who look like regular humans but without free will and an eerie blue glow in their eyes and locked into some hive mind were also just walking around and cleaning the place and transferring energy to the dragon priest. Not gonna lie, that would actually be a pretty interesting setting, but it's speculation. We have no real idea whether or not that kind of situation actually happened, or if the priests only buried themselves in the tombs with their followers after the dragon cult lost. There are also some conflicting reports on that, so just take it all with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, another interesting tidbit of confirmed lore is that while some Nordic children's stories actually seem to have the Draugr as a sort of scare for children, some Nords don't even seem to believe in the Draugr's existence, specifically Nords who have never been close to the ancient tombs, while other, more traditionally minded Nords may even be able to trace their lineage back to a family member or family members buried in the tomb and then refuse to fight the Draugr out of fear of dishonoring an ancient family member. We actually see that happen in the lore book Kain's Challenge. Pretty interesting. And a final bit of lore is that there seem to be multiple ways to make a Draugr, or at least multiple cults and multiple beings seem to have known how the Draugr's creation worked, because we know that not all Draugr that we see in the game, especially those on Solstheim and some in tombs that aren't really connected to the dragon cult, they still contain Draugr. And some of them, for example, were made out of punishment in lore, although that may be an unreliable narrator, so it might be the case that those were actually Dragon Cult tombs and then just other legends developed around them. But just keep in mind that this kind of necromancy seems to have been a little more common back in the days of the Dragon Cult and a little bit after. And that's about all I can say about the Draugr. Next up, let's talk about one of the enemies that I dreaded facing the most when playing Skyrim for the first few times, the creepy Chaurus. A creature many veteran Skyrim players are likely familiar with. The Chaurus is a large predatory arthropod that lives in the darkest caves of Skyrim and the border regions of the province. These creatures are quite strong and annoying in combat. They are known to players and the very few people on Tamriel who have encountered them for their aggressive nature and quite effective combat abilities, including the production of a potent poison which they can shoot at their enemies from a distance. In addition to these poisonous ranged attacks, Chaurus also possess razor-sharp teeth, making them highly dangerous in close quarters combat as well. Now, we don't know all that much about the origins of the Chaurus, however some have speculated that they might be the result of ancient snow elf experiments to create war beasts. This theory kind of aligns with the fact that the Chaurus have been domesticated by the Falmer, the descendants of the snow elves who keep the creatures in pens to breed them for defense and to use the creatures' chitin to craft durable armor. Now, beyond their utility for the Falmer, the Chaurus also strangely have found a place into Nordic cuisine, with their meat being described as a rare delicacy to some, but considering how dangerous these creatures are and the places that we find them in, I doubt that many Nords would actually know what they taste like, save for adventurers who are forced to eat them when they are stuck in caves or people rich enough to have mercenaries sent into caves to fetch Chaurus meat, because while the Falmer have domesticated them, it doesn't seem like any other race had managed to do so, or perhaps they just never tried. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Chaurus is their life cycle, as its life cycle is kinda weird and has some strange aspects to it. Because they begin their lives as eggs from which they hatch into a small young hatchling Chaurus. They then grow into adult creatures, the adult Chauruses that we find in the caves of Skyrim, but then, upon their death, their story isn't over. You see, the corpse of a dead Chaurus becomes a cocoon of sorts, and inside that cocoon grows the next stage in their life cycle. Because from within the decaying shell of the dead creature, a new form known as the Chaurus Hunter emerges, which is a flying and more dangerous version of the Chaurus and is seemingly their ultimate form. Now, something interesting to note here is that we don't know when exactly the Chaurus lay their eggs. Many believe that the eggs, which are very valuable for alchemists by the way, are produced before the Chaurus dies the first time and enters its cocoon stage, meaning that the reproductive part of their life cycle all takes place before their ultimate hunter form comes into the world. Some of those same people have speculated that the Chaurus Hunter is in fact a sort of undead creature, but I don't know about that. Although I do think it's likely that their reproduction takes place during the regular Chaurus stage and not during the Hunter stage, but we don't exactly know. But that's about all we know about the Chaurus. Next up, let's talk about a creature that most Elder Scrolls players will be familiar with, because they either summoned them or died to them at some point, the Flame Atronach. So, the Flame Atronach, an elemental creature vaguely in the shape of a woman made of fire and molten rock. They are some of the most popular creatures to summon, being quite easy to summon with quite well-known incantations and being very powerful to boot. Now, when summoned, they can be highly territorial and they are, as such, excellent guardian summons. They are known to have very little in the forms of emotion with blank expressions, although other Daedric creatures actually describe them as irritable, which is pretty funny. It's said that summoning these creatures requires the incantation known as Coron's Peremptory Summons, an ancient spell which allows the user to summon Flame Atronachs. Now, while in-game we simply learn the skill book and then know the spell to summon a Flame Atronach, in the lore this would mean that we gain understanding of this incantation. And you see, Coron's Peremptory Summons is actually known as one of the more variable spells in the Elder Scrolls universe, as the incantation is apparently easily modified to change the duration of the summoning and to change the shape of the Flame Atronach that is summoned. Because we know that in the lore, Flame Atronachs exist not just in their default vaguely humanoid female form, rather they can be shaped into many different forms, with some forms even being used as mounts by extremely skilled conjurers, who then even stall them in a pocket realm of oblivion rather than a stable, which is pretty interesting. Now, some of the people who were able to first master the shaping of the Flame Atronach and mutate them through modifying their summoning were the conjuration masters of the Rennie clan, the high elves who settled in High Rock, who right now live only on this little island, which is the Isle of Balfiera. They were apparently the first to modify flame Atronachs, and even now in modern times, summoning and modifying an Atronach into an exotic shape is known to be a sort of magical test of proficiency for the Rennie sorcerers, which is pretty interesting. Now, these exotic forms of the flame Atronach do not seem to exist by default, as these mount forms and other mutations of the flame Atronach are seemingly always the result of conjurers modifying their summoning incantation. You see, flame Atronachs are Daedra, and as we talked about in my video on why the Daedra fear their so-called true names, each Daedra has a so-called true name, or Nimix, a sort of formula which perfectly describes their being. The more complex the Daedra is, the bigger the Nimic, or this formula which describes them. And this Nimic is used to create them and to bring them back to life in the waters of oblivion in order to regenerate after being vanquished, because when Daedra are slain, they will eventually regenerate in oblivion. These Nimics, it sounds kind of stupid, but they're kind of like a seed which you put into a generator, so a programming generator, for example your Minecraft world generator, although more games and programs use this principle. If you put a certain seed in, the game will always get the same world and same set of circumstances from this generator. And if you change the seed, you get a very different outcome, so in Minecraft terms you would get a different world. This is very basically how Daedra are created, because with that formula the exact same Daedra can be regenerated in Oblivion. But more information in my video on Nimics, which is in the description. Anyway, what's important for this video is that when the Flame Atronach is summoned through Corron's peremptory summons incantation, the conjurer can seemingly modify the Nimics of the summoned Flame Atronach pretty easily. Which is why the shape and properties of Flame Atronachs are sometimes changed upon summoning, especially when experienced conjurers conjure one. And when talking about really powerful conjurers, so near divine level, they are actually known to be able to change their being to such a degree that they can give the Flame Atronach thoughts and intelligence, as in their default state they are beings with definitely some intelligence but very low intelligence. Although it is pretty rare to be able to modify a Flame Atronach to that degree, usually it's just their shape. Although, like I said, in their default form, so if they are summoned without any changes, they will generally resemble a humanoid female. In fact, in the lore, people on Tamriel who don't know about the existence of Flame Atronachs will often mistake them at their first sighting for a female elf set on fire. And only on closer examination, when they see that this elf consists out of just fire and has horns instead of eyes and spikes of molten rock on their bodies, then they discover it's not a mortal but a fire elemental Daedra. Now, the simple fact that they look like humanoids, especially humanoid females, has led to some conjurers being attracted to them, and even keeping them around because they are nice to look at. And in some powerful conjurers, there is rumors that they have Flame Atronachs in their lineage, because it's then rumored that one of their ancestors mated with one of these creatures.
Degenerates.
Yeah, exactly, Todd, but the more you know. Anyway, that probably is just an unreliable rumor though, as they are fully made of flames and literally don't have reproductive parts, but I still thought it was pretty funny that we have that in the lore. Anyway, while some people assume that the spell used to summon them actually creates the Flame Atronach, that isn't true. In reality, Flame Atronachs are summoned from a place called the Infernus, a pocket realm of Oblivion inhabited entirely by Flame Atronachs. This realm is said to be one big and really boring world filled with lava, magma and fire, with the only thing other than lava and magma on the surface being crevices in the magma, spewing even more magma and lava into the already endless sea of molten rock that is the Infernus. It's said that this realm is very well known by conjurers, as it's one of the easiest to summon from, while at the same time it's almost never visited by anyone, and anyone who did visit the realm usually left really quickly, as apparently the temperature is so high that even other Daedric creatures cannot easily survive there, much less mortals, as we have no records of any mortals ever being able to enter it, with the only known other visitors being other Daedra, who were forced to leave pretty quickly apparently due to the temperature. Now, the interesting thing is that this realm, the Infernus, is actually super fascinating. Despite the landscape being boring, according to an in-universe expert on Daedric realms, it's one of the rarer types of realms. You see, while next to the big realms of the Daedric princes, there are more than 37,000 pocket realms in Oblivion that are known to exist, most of these are either realms created by one powerful creature who manifested their own realm from the chaos of Oblivion, or abandoned or ripped away parts of the Daedric Prince realms and then inhabited by other creatures after it was abandoned by or ripped away from the Daedric Prince in question, who originally created it. Now, the Infernus is neither of these types of realms, as the Infernus is known to be a collective realm, a realm created by the collective power and thoughts of its inhabitants, the Flame Atronachs. This type of realm is said to be very rare, and because each Flame Atronach is said to be quite similar, this results in the realm being quite uniform and mundane, consisting only of their basic elements, so fire, lava and magma and molten rocks and other forms. And in this simplicity, despite them being chaotic creatures, it seems that it's quite an organized realm, although organized to what degree, we don't know. We, for example, don't know about any social hierarchy. We know that creatures called Flame Atronach monarchs exist, but whether these are actual leaders in their realm or if it's just a name that mortals gave to stronger Flame Atronachs, we don't know. The only guy who was ever in there long enough to observe the Flame Atronachs in their natural state said that they looked too much alike and behaved in such a way that he wasn't able to discern whether or not they have some sort of hierarchy or if they just behave mindlessly in there. That being said, among the thousands of other Oblivion pocket realms, there's a completely opposite realm known as Takobar, or the fourth sinus of Takobar as some Daedric experts call it, which is a realm of endless cold, which has cold Flame Atronachs in it, so Flame Atronachs with blue flame that aren't hot, but instead are said to be super cold, and this is actually where the blue Flame Atronachs from Molech Baal's realm come from, as some of his servants imported them into his realm for him, which is pretty cool. However, that's about all I can say about Flame Atronachs. Next up, let's talk about another common sight across Skyrim and annoyance for many players, the Spriggans. So, Spriggans, forest creatures often seen with tree-like, almost human-like bodies, often with a body that resembles a humanoid female, although they can take on many more different shapes. Now, in essence, Spriggans are nature spirits and are often regarded as nature's guardians by the people of Tamriel. They appear to be completely made out of wood, but they can sometimes be covered in foliage, like leaves and branches as well, and they may also emit light from their bodies. In addition to that, some Spriggans have bugs and insects inhabiting their bodies, like bees and hornets, which they can also use in combat. Their main behavior pattern is that they protect the places of nature where they live, but they are observed to be calm and gentle with most natural creatures that live in the woods, really only being aggressive against travelers who wish harm upon nature and the places that they try to protect. Their relationship with the creatures of the forest is generally very friendly, and forest creatures like bears, foxes and insects will often aid the Spriggans in battle, but it's suggested that this may not be fully out of love for the Spriggans, but rather that the Spriggans may control these forest creatures with their own magic, forcing them to fight along with them, as we have instances where weak Spriggans are fighting with trolls, for example, while stronger Spriggans are defended by trolls, suggesting that they simply control these creatures, as if the Spriggan is stronger, they're able to dominate the troll, while weaker Spriggans can only dominate stuff like foxes. In battle, Spriggans tend to use their long fingers as blades, and they may take a bite with their sharp teeth out of their enemies. They also have the ability to poison living creatures, and they have strong healing powers that make them difficult enemies to put down for good, as their healing powers almost give them a second wind when they were just about to be killed. Now, the color of their bodies is actually different for different Spriggans, with some thinking that the change in color has to do with the environment that they live in and their adaptation to the environment. For example, in Morrowind's Snowy Souls time, we saw very light green, almost white Spriggans. In Skyrim's Green Glades, we see green ones. In volcanic regions, we see red burnt Spriggans. While some people speculate that this may have to do with the seasons, it seems to more have to do with their adaptation to the local environment that they are in. Now, how exactly the Spriggans came into being is as of yet unknown, but a general trend is that most cultures seem to believe that they were created by the gods or goddesses of nature. So it's believed by the Norse of Skyrim, for example, that Spriggans are the creation of the goddess Cain or Kinnereth, while the Bosmers or the Wood Elves and the Breton Druids, who think that the god Ifra is the god of nature, believe that nature spirits like Spriggans were all created by him. Meanwhile, according to the legends of the Nordic Skal tribe on Solstheim, Spriggans supposedly came into being when the Allmaker, the mysterious deity that the Skal primarily worship, blew his breath through the lands and trees, creating Spriggans as their guardians. What's interesting here is that the player base often just calls Spriggans Forest Atronachs or Wood Atronachs due to them looking kinda like forest flame Atronachs, but that's almost certainly not the case. You see, while flame Atronachs and frost Atronachs, for example, are Daedric creatures, which you have to summon from Oblivion, Spriggans seem to be forest spirits, explicitly native to Tamriel, and may even be Aedric creatures if you believe the theories about their creation, which is pretty cool. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Spriggans have some variants and different forms that they can take on. For example, as mentioned earlier, they can appear with several different color schemes, with the regular green Spriggan being the most common, but brown, orange and almost white super mint green and purple bluish variants also existing, with even wilder variants created through corruption. But apart from color differences, the Spriggan can actually come in quite a few different shapes and subspecies, with one of these variants being the Lurcher. Lurchers are made by corrupting a Spriggan with dark magic, which makes them even more powerful and makes them larger, which is why some call them the polluted cousins of Spriggans. Once a Spriggan has assumed the form of a Lurcher, it's said that the nature spirit within is actually corrupted and tortured, and that their spirit remains tortured until they are put down and killed. What's interesting here is that that's apparently not the only way to create a Lurcher, as while most methods known of creating Lurchers involve some form of dark magic, the forest-loving Bosmer actually create them to protect the forest, but it's suggested that they create Lurchers apparently not from Spriggans, but that they grow the husks of Lurchers themselves and then imbue them with power. Which is pretty interesting, but a topic for a different video, as Lurchers probably deserve their own video at some point. On that point, we also have the Gnarl, a Spriggan-like creature which may have been created in imitation of the Spriggans, or maybe a Daedric prince's corruption of the Spriggan, which also deserves their own video, or at least belong in an Interesting Creatures of the Plains of Oblivion video. But to get back on topic, another trio of variants are the Burnt Spriggan found on Solstheim after the eruption of the Red Mountain in the 4th era and on volcanic regions around Tamriel, and the Spriggan Matron and the Spriggan Earth Mother. Burnt Spriggans are a flaming variant of Spriggan that use destructive flame spells instead of nature magic. They can be found in volcanic regions, and they have a far worse temperament compared to their woodland kin, and when they are close to death they explode with fire. And even though this seems like a regular Spriggan that just got burnt, it seems that this is actually an adaptation variant of the Spriggan, so a variant that adapted to its environment, and not really, a regular Spriggan that somehow got burned, which is pretty interesting. Now, something else that's pretty interesting is that Spriggan Earth Mothers are a more powerful version of the regular Spriggans. They often have a purple coloring and are far better at controlling nature when compared to their lesser kin, with them being able to control very powerful creatures. Spriggan Matrons seem to be a variant more powerful than regular Spriggans, but lesser than the Earth Mothers. The Matrons often have an orange coloring in contrast to the regular green Spriggan and the Earth Mothers that have a purple coloring. What's interesting here is that these titles, like Matron, suggest a hierarchy among Spriggans, and in some cases we can even see a group of Spriggans being led by a Matron or an Earth Mother, which is pretty cool, and suggests a more complex way of life than we actually know about. Now, other than morphing into more powerful variants, Spriggans are also capable of morphing into more animalistic shapes, such as bears and large cats, and on the island of Galen we can find colossal Spriggans. Now, it's unknown if these giant variants of Spriggans are actually native to these islands, or that they can be found in other places, but on Galen there's actually one Spriggan, a really large powerful blue Spriggan, that can give us a clue. That Spriggan is called the Preserver of Galen, and it's said that the Preserver, which is seemingly an ancient colossal Spriggan that wanders the island and seeks to drive out all non-druids from the land, was summoned to protect this land. Its lore states that it was once summoned by the druids, who over the ages forgot how to control it, which is actually quite interesting, and it may mean that the other colossal Spriggans of the island may have also been summoned, or may be offspring of those who were summoned, or may all be offspring of the Preserver of Galen. But unfortunately we just don't know anything more than that. Now, talking about offspring though, several interactions in the games reveal that Spriggans actually procreate through seeds, and that from a seed can grow a new Spriggan. Now, we don't know their reproductive methods, so how they create those seeds, at all. All we know is that they come from seeds, and my personal speculation is that it's likely that the Earth Mothers create the seeds, since, that's why they're probably called Earth Mothers, since they put seeds in the earth. But since Spriggans are spirits and can take on whatever shape that they want to take on, I presume that their reproduction is asexual, especially as there's a side quest in the Elder Scrolls Online which suggests that one Spriggan is enough to repopulate an entire area with them, suggesting that you don't need multiple Spriggans for reproduction, as one Spriggan can seemingly produce the necessary seeds in time. Now, as I said earlier, Spriggans are regarded as nature's guardians, but despite being revered by some people on Tamriel for protecting nature, they often live in secluded places, often beautiful places which they tend to protect against harm, and also protect against those who even revere the Spriggans. They more often than not attack travelers, possibly because of any encroachment on their territory, and because that encroachment is then seen as an attack on nature itself by these creatures, and they rarely tolerate people inside their glades. Now, considering that there's a well-known joke, popular among children of Tamriel, that goes, "Guess what? Spriggan butt." I have no idea what the context of the joke is, but it's a joke that's apparently popular with children on Tamriel. I personally speculate that children at the very least do not fear these woodland spirits to any great extent, since there are no jokes about, for example, werewolf butts to my knowledge. Meaning that perhaps in children's stories, the Spriggan isn't really presented as a big threat, but rather as a good-natured protector of nature. While adults generally tend to fear the Spriggans to a greater degree, especially travelers traveling through the woods. Alchemists, on the other hand, value Spriggans. Or, more correctly, they rather value the ingredients that Spriggan bodies provide, as they provide quite a lot of useful ingredients for potions. Like primarily taproot, but also belladonna berries, heartwood, Spriggan sap, primal sproutling and more. In other words, a treasure trove for many alchemists. And once a year, Spriggans tend to shed their branches and their leaves, which are called the Spriggan's veil when shed, and these are valued by mages and herbalists alike because they are thought to be useful in druid practices and to have a symbolic meaning. And there's even a witches circle, the Glenmariel Weird, that are believed to use Spriggan sap in their tattoo ink, in hope that the one who has the tattoos may find a deeper bond with nature through nature's protectors. Now, on a final note, Spriggans actually have a language that's unique to them, although in Daggerfall we see that this language can be learned and can be used to calm Spriggans. And some scholars believe that Spriggans actually cannot behave in an intelligent manner and that they are creatures who act purely on instinct, attacking travelers and the people of Tamriel indiscriminately. But that's decidedly not true, as we know that not only can Spriggans learn and speak Tamrielic, as we have several examples in the games, they can even negotiate and reason. One time that this happens is in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, where you can speak to one of them. In that game you can find a Spriggan that can tell you that it killed people in the woods who had destroyed her seedlings. It then asks what the player would do if someone killed his seedlings, and then tells the player that it wishes no ill will upon the player, and that if the woodsman who destroyed their seedlings handle the woods with more care in the future, she could let them live in peace. This shows that not only do they try to protect nature, but even more importantly, this interaction also shows that Spriggans have a certain level of intelligence, the capability of reason, emotion and negotiation. So based on that, it would be hard to argue that they are stupid and act only on instinct, as they are clearly more intelligent than that. And that is about all I can say about the Spriggans. Next up, let's talk about a creature that most Skyrim players don't even realize is in the game, but is still very much there if you seek deeply enough in some caves. The Shellbug. The Shellbug is a pretty mysterious and fascinating creature, primarily known for its hard, durable carapace, which is highly valued by the Falmer for crafting armor. These large insects are bred deep underground by the Falmer for the purpose of harvesting their carapaces. Interestingly, Shellbugs are not aggressive and they either move very slowly or completely immobile, raising questions about how they might survive in the wild if left on their own. To harvest their tough carapace, a pickaxe or other type of hard equipment is required, as their shell is incredibly sturdy and hard, and when their carapaces are completely mined out, they die. Now, despite this unique piece of lore, we know very little about the Shellbug, and I honestly wish that we knew more about them. If I had to do any speculation, I'd say that they might be related somehow to the Chaurus, but that's just going off their creature design, but we don't really know much more about them in the lore, unfortunately. Which means that it's now time to talk about the next creature that we can encounter in Skyrim. Next up, let's talk about a creature that's the enemy to anyone wanting to fast travel next to a river or a lake or a pond or even in the middle of a field. The Mudcrabs. So, Mudcrabs, probably one of the creatures most encountered all around Tamriel. They're a very common sight in basically every mainline Elder Scrolls games and are, let's say, not the strongest or most fearsome type of enemy. Most people would likely write them off immediately, saying that they're just crabs and not that interesting. But they do in fact have some lore to them, which I'd like to explore today. So let's start talking about their basic behavior patterns. Mudcrabs tend to live by rivers, and when they are not active, bury themselves in the sand in hope of camouflaging themselves as a rock, specifically when they sleep in hopes of being unseen by bigger predators. There are many different types of mudcrab found all around Tamriel, with some looking more like rocks and some looking more like conventional crabs. There's even those in coastal regions which don't look like rocks at all, but rather look like coral, like the one that you see on screen right now. Mudcrabs are generally non-aggressive creatures unless they are threatened, cornered or provoked according to the lore, although in the games we do get plenty of examples of mudcrabs attacking unprovoked, and that's because according to an Elder Scrolls Online lorebook, mudcrabs are highly territorial. They tend to claim parts of the coast or rivers to be their own, or that of their groups, as some of them live in groups. And when that territory is breached by something or someone that they perceive as a threat, they will fearlessly attack the intruder, even if they realistically stand absolutely no chance against them in combat. According to some in-universe scholars, mudcrabs even have an overblown combat prowess, thinking greater of themselves than they actually are. With this I mean that they attack intruders with the genuine idea that they're going to win. This is unlike some animals in nature which will only attack out of genuine self-defense and desperation, knowing that they won't win. I like that, you know, the idea of mudcrabs. If they could speak, they would be a bit like the Black Knight from Monty Python and just never give up, going like,
"Didn't I murder?" Come on then! What? Have at you!
Because of this battle prowess, mudcrabs will also often fight other animals with their sharp pincers, and in the case when it's hungry, go out for food hunting, as they are carnivores. In their hunting parties they can be a real nuisance to farmers, as with enough crabs, a mudcrab herd, or a mudcrab clutch as groups of them are called, can kill and devour cows, pigs and other livestock, leading to some farmers living close to rivers getting real headaches out of them. However, if there are no farms nearby to raid, or other animals on the land or fish in the water to hunt, mudcrabs have shown to be cannibalistic in certain cases. That said, not all mudcrabs are aggressive to Tamriel's travelers, as some types, like the common mudcrab that we see in the Elder Scrolls Online, the smallest type, doesn't seem to see the player as a threat and will not attack unless provoked directly. But the interesting thing here is that the bigger the mudcrab gets, the more aggressive it seems to be to players. This leads me to believe that the small mudcrabs that are not as aggressive see the player not as really a threat to their territory unless attacked, as the player is so much bigger and concerns themselves with different things than the mudcrab, and thus the crab doesn't really see the player as a threat to its own goals and to its own territory. Because it seems that the mudcrabs, like pigeons for example in our world, can get used to humans and not perceive them as a threat. And there's this specific text by an in-universe scholar who spent a long time studying a clutch of mudcrabs by a river, and while aggressive at first, once they perceived him not to be a threat to their territory, they literally paid him no mind and just saw him as a part of their territory, as he could even pet them and they didn't even react to him. While that same clutch did react violently to a bear breaching their territory, managing to scare the bear off as they had strength in numbers. But the interesting thing here is that once mudcrabs don't see someone as a threat, they can even be, taken as pets, as they don't pay any mind to you. Even though you still need to be careful just to not provoke them and have them perceive you as a threat. Anyway, mudcrabs, when you attack them, are generally not that strong, save for some very small exceptions like the gigantic mudcrab or specific mudcrab bosses created by the developers. This means that even though they are a nuisance to farmers, a farmer can easily, take his family and just take a couple of pitchforks and take out a clutch of mudcrabs all by themselves. And once they have been taken out, there are some interesting uses to them, as their chitin and meat have been shown both to be edible, and the chitin and legs specifically holding some alchemical properties, and certain mudcrab variants even carrying poison in their pincers. That said, we don't really know the complete origin of mudcrabs. However, one theory states that they are descendants of the gigantic emperor land crabs, which crawled across northern Tamriel back in the Dawn and Mradic eras. They were gigantic, intelligent creatures with, according to an unreliable narrator, divine pursuits. But then at some point they gave up these divine pursuits and slowly devolved into the mudcrabs that we know today. That said, in early Chimer history, the Chimer even hunted these emperor crabs, and apparently quite successfully, taken quite some of them down. This could mean that they're devolving into the mudcrabs, which is generally believed but not 100% certain that that's the case, that they devolved into the Mudcrabs. That maybe came out of a necessity to procreate quicker and evade hunters, or perhaps the Emperor Mudcrabs, the bigger ones, were all hunted down and only the smaller ones remain. We don't actually know that for certain. But what we do know is that one of the larger Emperor crabs now forms the central hall for the city of Ald'ruhn, where the Dwemer live in the gigantic carapace. And in Skyrim's Creation Club fishing extension we can even see a gigantic Emperor crab ghost, and according to Make the Liar, they aren't actually extinct, and that they can still be found in the deepest part of the oceans, that they've maybe been, if that's the case, if that they've just been, you know, fleeing there after being hunted on Tamriel. But I don't know how much truth there is to that, as after all, Maik is a liar. Anyway, more on the Emperor Crab in my video on Sea Monsters of Tamriel's Oceans, which is in the description of this video. Anyway, back to Mudcrabs. It's shown that Mudcrabs, like their ancestors, the ancient Emperor Crab, are capable of showing some intelligence, with some even showing higher intelligence, like the talking Mudcrab merchant from Morrowind who has a drinking problem, but that Mudcrab could also just be a gag and not really accurate lore. But we're doing this video, so I'm mentioning it, because there doesn't seem to be much more to mention. But that does mean that that's about all the lore that we have on Mudcrabs. Next up, let's talk about the Falmer, or the Twisted Falmer, or the Betrayed, as some call them. Specifically, let's talk about how the Snow Elves, once a mighty people, became these twisted and deranged creatures. So, the Snow Elves, the milk-white skinned race of elf that lived in the area now known as Skyrim ever since some of the Altmer, the progenitor race to all races of elf on Tamriel, migrated from the Somerset Isles to the northern reaches of Tamriel. They seem to have been very similar to High Elves, except with white hair and very light white skins, and they seem to be more resistant to cold than most races of elf. In the northern reaches of Tamriel they built a civilization that was said to be one of the great powers of ancient Tamriel. Their civilization was said to be advanced enough to rival the elves left behind on the Somerset Isles and the Ayleid Empire in the heartland of Tamriel. Very little is known about their civilization during this high period of the Snow Elves, when they were at the peak of their power, as the Nords, who would wipe them out several centuries later, made sure to destroy as much of their history as they could. But from what we know that they were quite a religious people, worshipping a similar pantheon of gods to the modern day High Elves, with their chief deity being Auriel, with Trinamax, Ciribane, Jeffrey and Finister also being represented in their pantheons, with many of the ancient Snow Elves wishing to be more close to the gods and to be one with the gods. Now we also know that they had an advanced writing system and their own calendar, which differed highly from the Tamrielic calendars that we know. You see, while the Tamrielic calendar that we know basically mimics the Gregorian calendar from our world, just with different names, the Falmer calendar had a strange system that we haven't quite figured out yet, but it makes use of so-called markings and kulnirs, which are both seemingly measures of time, with markings likely either being a week or a day, and kulnirs likely being something akin to either a month or a year, as markings seem to change quicker than kulnirs in Snow Elf journals, meaning that kulnirs likely talk about a longer period of time. But we don't really know how the system works precisely. Actually, we have no actual idea. Some on Tamriel suggested that the markings and kulnirs may not even be units of time specifically, but rather maybe the filling of time ewers, which then gets recorded by journals. But even then, that's just speculation of in-universe scholars. Still, it's quite interesting though that their entire system was completely different from the other systems on Tamriel. Now, their language was said to be complicated, but in a sense quite similar to that of the Ayleids, with there being enough similarities in order for you to roughly understand Falmer texts if you know the Ayleid language, although many words seem to differ in the language. Their writing system was also very similar to that of other elves, although their letters are far more complicated and stylized than most other races of elves' writing, with it being more similar to the Ayleidun language or the ancient Altmer language, than something like the Dwemer, which was highly simplified. Now, other than that, we know that they likely had kings and queens, and we know that they were able to build some of the most advanced architecture and statues of that period in Tamriel's history, and we also know that the color white played a pretty big role in their iconography and architecture, as they made almost everything of snow white color and stone. Now finally, we also know that magic played quite a big role in their society, with magic being central to some of the methods of transportation, and the Snow Elf race as a whole having a relatively high aptitude for magic. And that is basically all we know about their culture, as everything else from their foods to their governmental system was all erased from history by the Nords after centuries of conflict.
You see, while the Snow Elves had lived in Skyrim for hundreds of years, at some point ships started landing on Skyrim's northern shores. Ships full of humans who came from Atmora, the ancestral homeland of the humans. Now, at first these were mostly criminals who were exiled from Atmora and second sons of nobles looking for adventure and glory in far-off lands with their retinue. The humans weren't really not all that much more than a curiosity in those days, and most humans traveled further south to warmer lands, eventually becoming the Proto-Imperials and the humans of Hammerfell. But some stuck around, living in Skyrim with the Snow Elves in what has been called an uneasy harmony, where both races just kinda tolerated each other and didn't really bother each other too much. But the humans kept coming and coming from Atmora, as more and more humans decided to colonize Tamriel. And eventually small human villages became small cities, and small cities became larger cities, and the human Proto-Nords gradually expanded their influence over the continent, and throughout the province of Skyrim. Now, we don't know much about this period. In fact, all we know is that eventually it led to tragedy, as the first official Atmoran colony on Tamriel, and also the largest city of the Proto-Nords, the city of Saarthal, eventually became the site of a massive raid by the Snow Elves, who are said to have killed off the entire population of Proto-Nords living in the city and had burned the entire city to the ground. Why exactly they did this, we don't know. It's been suggested that the Eye of Magnus that we find during the College of Winterhold questline was the cause, as the humans found it in the ground and the Snow Elves then wanted it, as it has extreme power, leading the Snow Elves to destroying the city to get their hands on the Eye of Magnus. But it's also been suggested that the geopolitical tensions had been mounting between the two races either way, with the Snow Elves being uneasy and angry about the massive human expansion. What the true reason is, we don't know. You see, almost everything we know about this period, I dare say everything about this period, unless I missed a source, is either interpreted by people who lived thousands of years after the event, or is taken from Nordic mythology and histories, which both aren't super reliable, especially Nordic histories, as we know that the Nords did everything that they could to demonize the Snow Elves. So yeah, it's possible that something else may have caused the tragedy of Saarthal, but if so, it's either been erased from history or we will just never find out. Anyway, this massacre of Saarthal led to one of the few survivors, Lord Ysgramor, later the legendary King Ysgramor, to travel back to Atmora and petition their ancient homeland for help. He then came with the 500 companions, which likely was a massive army instead of just 500 men, just like the 300 Spartans were actually not 300 Spartans in our universe, but a pretty big fighting force, which had 300 Spartans but a lot more men next to them as well. Anyway, doesn't really matter about the numbers, but Ysgramor and his men returned to Tamriel and they were ready for round 2. And from the moment that they landed on Tamriel, the war was on and they started conquering Skyrim from the Snow Elves, killing many in the process and committing pretty horrible atrocities against the Snow Elves in the process, ending the Snow Elf dominance in Skyrim. Mostly as a revenge for what happened in Saarthal, according to the histories. Now, something interesting here is that while many lore videos like this one and articles online seem to claim that from this point on it was full-on killing and the Nords did not stop killing Snow Elves until there were none left, it was a far more gradual process than that. You see, while Ysgramor's initial conquering seemed to have signaled the end of Snow Elf dominance in Skyrim, it was by no means the end of their culture, although it was the start of an ages-long conflict between the two races, where the Snow Elves gradually became less and less powerful, because the Snow Elves were still around by the time of the Dragon War and were able to build cities and temples until the early First Era. However, this seems to have been a time where the Nords had very little regard for their culture, and if they required their land, they simply took it from the Snow Elves. And wherever the Snow Elves lived under Nordic rule, they seem to have been virtually second-class citizens. It was only when Harold, the first High King of all of Skyrim, actually started to try and get rid of all Snow Elf holdings and culture in Skyrim, centuries after the initial conquest of Ysgramor, that Snow Elf culture was truly pushed to the brink and eventually pushed to extinction. These lost years between Ysgramor's conquest and Harold's conquest have been pretty terribly documented, but they are a period of at least 300 to 500 years in which the Snow Elves endured, but in a Nord-dominated Skyrim. We don't know what caused the final schism and confrontation which led King Harold and his heirs to try and actually get rid of all Snow Elves and completely erase them from history by burning their records and destroying their buildings, but we do know that they were pretty successful, as very little remains of Snow Elf culture after the First Era, with only ruins deep underground remaining in some places and hidden enclaves that the Nords never found still remaining, like the Forgotten Vale that we visit in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC. But even with the fury of the Nords at their heels, the Snow Elves did not go down without a fight. These were wars with many casualties on both sides, but the Nords would prevail, as eventually they pushed the Snow Elves to the brink of extinction after killing as many as they could and destroying as many settlements as they could find. During this time, many Snow Elves went into hiding. Now, interestingly enough, it seems that not all the Nords hated the Snow Elves all that much, as some helped Snow Elf families hide themselves from the king's armies in occupied territories. But it did not help to stave off their eventual near extinction, as during the first couple of centuries of the First Era, the final battle of the Nords against the Snow Elves would take place. It was the Snow Elves' final stand on the island of Solstheim, which had been long a safe haven away from the Nords, but after driving out or killing the Elves on the mainland, the Nords came for Solstheim, where the last leader of the Snow Elves, someone that we only remember as the Snow Prince, would make his last stand against the Nords, who came with overwhelming fury. But it did not matter in the end. Despite his valiant stand and many Nords killed, the Snow Prince and his men could not stand against the onslaught. Now, legend says that the Snow Prince, after killing many great Nord warriors, was killed by a young girl, Finna, who had thrown her mother's sword at the prince after the prince had killed her mother on the battlefield. This blow killed the Snow Prince, and now leaderless, the Snow Elves had fought their final fight. Those who remained had few choices left. Some seemed to have fled Skyrim and intermingled with the High Elves, the Aelids and the Durenni Elves, with some elves nowadays in Tamriel still believing that they have Snow Elf blood in them due to these refugees who fled, and others hid themselves away in hidden places like the Chantry of Auriel and the Forgotten Vale, hoping to escape further onslaught. But the vast majority of survivors of the final battles against the Nords would find even further tragedy, as they turned to the underground dwelling Dwemer for help. Now, most people by now know the story. The beaten down Snow Elves came to the Dwemer for aid and refuge, and their ancient allies decided to provide that help, but at a terrible price, as any who would want to find refuge in Dwemer cities was forced to eat a strange fungus which would blind them. That was the Dwemer's demand. Many agreed, leading to the blinding of the majority of the surviving Snow Elves, and from that point on it was even more downhill for them, as the Dwemer soon revealed their true colors and started to treat those who sought refuge in their cities as slaves, forcing them into slave labor and mistreating them horribly, brutally torturing anyone who did not submit to them. It's been suggested that during this time the Dwemer also used tonal magic or sound magic on the Snow Elves to influence their minds and keep them in line. Some of these machines we can still see working in the Elder Scrolls Online, where it shows that when they malfunction, nearby creatures get driven completely mad, and while we don't know for certain, this might have also been part of the reason as to why after several generations of enslavement, the Snow Elves eventually became far more warped and corrupted, as the Dwemer simply bred them for slavery and influenced their minds. Now, slowly over the years they were warped and corrupted into the hideous blind Falmer that we see in the games. Interestingly, Falmer was the original name of their race, translating roughly to Snow Elf, but those Snow Elves who survived the onslaught and denied the Dwemer's bargain would stop using that name, calling themselves simply the Snow Elves, as the name Falmer would soon be linked to the hideous creatures which were betrayed and enslaved by the Dwemer. It's a terrible fate that so many endured, although there was one point in time when the Falmer, already far in their corruption and almost unrecognizable to what their ancestors had once looked like, started to rebel against the Dwemer. We don't know much about this rebellion, but we do know that this rebellion quickly spread throughout all the Dwemer cities in Skyrim, where the corrupted Snow Elves rebelled against their Dwemer masters in what's now known as the War of the Crag, a conflict that the Falmer slowly started to win around the year 700 of the First Era. But then the Dwemer disappeared. They simply vanished. And when their masters were gone and the war was over, the now corrupted and blinded Snow Elves were free. But were they really free, as their race had descended into a corruption so bad that nothing of their previous culture seemed to remain, as they had now been warped into creatures closer to goblins than to elves, and even their very souls had been warped, as no longer did their souls need black soul gems to be captured, which are used for intelligent races, but now a simple white soul gem was enough, indicating that something fundamental had truly changed in their being, again possibly due to Dwemer tonal magic. In the subsequent years, the Falmer would take over the Dwemer cities for themselves, and some would rediscover that there was a whole world above them, the surface world. Although very few Falmer would tread there in the beginning, slowly but surely more and more sometimes left their caves and ruins by night, starting to raid Nordic villages and steal cattle and murder sleeping Nords. By later eras, most people see the Falmer as mere more than legend, a scary boogeyman of children's stories. but those living close to Dwemer ruins and cave systems know better, as sometimes on dark nights the Falmer come out and steal their cattle and murder their children. By the 4th era, it's said by Paladin Galabor, one of the very few remaining actual snow elves who we meet during the Dawnguard questline, that over the centuries he's seeing a rising in intelligence, and so do some scholars who have tried to study the Falmer, as they say that the Falmer are becoming more organized than they ever were, with raiding parties being more organized and a hierarchy actually existing in their society. Not just that, they actually keep and breed creatures for livestock, they seem to have shrines to some god, and they seem to be able to build relatively advanced structures. This may point towards further evolution, or perhaps generations and millennia are slowly starting to wear off the corruption caused by the Dwemer. Now, does that mean that there's hope for them? Perhaps. I don't think it's likely that they will ever return to their former glory or appearance, though as Paladin Galabor says, perhaps if they become even more intelligent, the people of Tamriel could once again communicate with them, and with communication actually give them a proper place in this world. But if that's ever to happen, it's likely centuries away. However, there's one additional thing that we need to talk about when talking about the Falmer, and it's the weird religion that they started to develop after their betrayal by the Dwemer. I discovered this after the original video which you just listened to, and it's fascinating, let's just say. So, the Falmer, the twisted and blind descendants of the snow elves that were tortured and poisoned by the dwarves or Dwemer over the course of centuries after being blinded, leading to them devolving into the twisted forms that we encounter in the games. Their story is quite tragic, and for the full story on their betrayal and devolving, I recommend watching my dedicated video on them, which is in the description. But what's important to know for this video is that at the very end of the Dawnguard questline in Skyrim, Knight Paladin Galabor says that he's noticing a rise of intelligence of the blind and twisted creatures, and that they are becoming more organized and that they are becoming smarter again after eons of devolving. One part of this advancement in their intelligence seems to be a somewhat organized society and somewhat organized religion. You see, the Falmer seem to be loosely organized in tribes with warriors, workers, leaders, and crucially also shamans, which are Falmer who practice magic and seem to fulfill some sort of religious duty within their tribe and society. And in Skyrim's concept art, the Falmer shaman is also literally called the Falmer priestess, which again points towards some religious function within their society. Now, what it exactly is that they worship is unclear, and we only have the vaguest notion of what their religion is all about. But in Skyrim, in the cave dungeon The Sightless Pit, which is a Falmer-infested dungeon, we can find a cave with the area name the Temple of Scrib, which is a Dwemer ruin in a big glittering cave, much like Blackreach. Now, the cave itself is quite beautiful, but when I first saw that name, the Temple of Scrib, I was like, who is Scrib? Well, it turns out that Scrib is most likely the name that the Falmer have given to the thing or deity that they worship. In fact, in the game's code and in the official Skyrim game guide, there's another location related to Scrib, and it's practically on top of the Sightless Pit, and it's this Dwemer structure that's now being used as an altar to Scrib, and in the official game guide the place is literally called Altar to Scrib. Now, who exactly this Scrib is, we don't know, but there are three prevailing theories so far. The first theory is that it's a completely unique deity to the Falmer that we've otherwise never heard of, and perhaps it's even related to the insect god that the Aelids used to worship and that we know even less about than we know about Scrib. While that's possible, I personally lean towards any of the two other theories, where the Falmer have ascribed the name Scrib to an already existing deity. The first deity mentioned in these theories is that the Falmer actually worshipped the Daedric prince Namira, Daedric prince of decay, hunger, dark and death. The reason for this theory is that around any Falmer altar that we find, including the Temple of Scrib, we can find human, elf, Argonian and Khajiit sacrifices, meaning that they basically sacrifice the intelligent races, often in a torturous and painful manner while mutilating their bodies. We can see the results of this around their shrines, and we can see how after their sacrifices they put the body parts of those people that they sacrificed on stakes as a sort of religious totem. Very disturbing stuff, but that's a bit similar to the manner of worship used by some cults of Namira, which is what led to a lot of people speculating that Scrib is actually the Falmer name for the Daedric prince Namira. Now, the second theory stems mostly from these totem shrines that we can find in some Falmer locations, as people say that this totem, created out of Chaurus insect parts, is supposed to be Scrib, and those same people have observed that, hey, this religious totem looks very much like some religious totems to the Daedric Prince of Knowledge, Hermaeus Mora, and it even kinda resembles how he looks in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. The theory then goes that it was Hermaeus Mora who somehow communicates with the Falmer shamans in their own language and taught them the magic that they can use, which is why they then worship him. However, sacrifices are not really his thing, that's more Namira's thing, but it's still very possible that the sacrifices are simply a cruelty added to his worship by the Twisted Falmer, and that he just doesn't really care and just lets them do whatever. But I still highly lean towards the Namira theory. That being said, whoever Scrib is, their magic is quite useful for the Falmer, as in the Temple of Scrib we can see that any Falmer or Chaurus that dies on the big altar in the Glittering Cave is resurrected, possibly by the altar's pillars. So that's pretty interesting and kind of opens a fourth theory. And that is that Scrib really isn't a deity, but rather just strange Dwemer magic in that specific altar, and that the Falmer just don't fully understand that magic and that they just decided to start worshipping that magic as a god. But then that does not explain the shrines and similar worship all around Skyrim, so I suppose it's a matter of pick your theory, whichever you think is most likely. Me personally, I'm going with the Namira theory. That being said, that's about all that we know and that I can reasonably theorize on Scrib and the Falmer religion. However, I've got just one little last piece for you, if you'll indulge me, and that's a bit of theory or headcanon by JustinYa91 on the Elder Scrolls Reddit. A theory that I personally really like, but that we have zero evidence for, so just take it as a bit of amusing headcanon. His theory goes that whatever deity Scrib is, the Falmer started worshipping it after going mad and after their prayers to their original snow elf gods went unanswered as they were being tortured by the Dwemer. They prayed and prayed, but their gods remained silent, and then some shaman or priest came up with Scrib, whatever Scrib was, around the time of the Dwemer disappearing from Nirn, and when their slavers suddenly disappeared, the guy or gal who came up with Scrib was hailed as some sort of savior, and Scrib became their deity. Again, we have zero evidence for this, I just really like the theory. And that's all we can say about the Falmer religion. Next up, let's talk about creatures that we've often encountered in the same space as the Falmer, the Dwemer Automatons, and specifically, how do they work? And a little bit of a warning, in order to try and understand how they work, I go into some, nitty gritty with steam engines and some physics and mechanical engineering, so if you're not interested in that kind of thing, feel free to skip to the next creature. Reminder, there's timestamps in the description. So, as anyone who has played Skyrim, The Elder Scrolls Online and Morrowind knows, Dwemer ruins are full of their ancient automatons, also often called animunculi. These automatons are some of the more interesting enemies in the Elder Scrolls series we face, as they are artificially built and have been operating autonomously from their long disappeared Dwemer masters for thousands of years. And as the cherry on top, we don't really know how they work. We have some puzzle pieces and I'll try to piece them together as best I can, but the full picture still eludes us. Now, we have these Dwemer animunculi in many shapes and sizes. We have very small scarabs, which we can get as pets in the Elder Scrolls Online. We have worker spiders, combat spiders, gigantic combat centurions, and several other combat models like spheres and ballista. The Dwemer likely use their automatons for many different purposes, from maintenance to their cities, to guarding important places, to likely keeping public order in the cities and helping them on the battlefield in war. Most of the automatons are built out of Dwemer brass, or as Skyrim calls it, dwarven metal. Now, we don't know how this metal is created, as it's far stronger than both steel, bronze and brass, and many in-universe blacksmiths have tried and failed to recreate it. The only way that we know how to use it is by melting down existing Dwemer metal, so either scrap or armor or swords or whatever, and then repurpose it. It got dull really slowly when used in weapons, and it was apparently almost unbreakable. As such, it was used in all the Dwemer's weapons and armor. Armor which, by the way, was not only worn for combat but also as protective gear against cave-ins when digging for their cities. They also used the metal for buildings to complement the stonework and of course to construct their automatons. Now, we know that in addition to being made out of this metal, the automatons are made up of gears and a gyro, both made out of that metal, and a lot of metal scrap that we don't know the purpose of, and a soul gem. Now, we know that there's some kind of oil tank inside the automatons, as oil can be looted from the automatons. The interesting thing about this oil is that we have lore on it that it says that it becomes useless to alchemists when exposed to air for some time, as it changes properties when it's exposed to air. This likely means that the Dwemer created oil which does not need refreshing as long as it's kept away from the air, so as long as it's kept in a vacuum. Even a short exposure to air can make it go bad real quickly, hence why alchemists try to bottle it as quickly as possible after taking down an automaton. Now, the reason they also seem to have a gyro is to make sure the automatons remain balanced and don't fall over, hence why almost every type of automaton has them, as specifically the upright spheres and centurions would have trouble remaining in balance without a decent gyroscope. Now, several lore books have told us that, despite not finding them as loot, we also know that the automatons have a boiler, which is logical as we know that the automatons are all powered by steam in addition to magic, as a boiler is essentially a reservoir with a liquid in it, usually water, which is heated up in order to make steam. This boiler is not useful to the player as, you know, it's a boiler, not a weapon, and we can't realistically expect Bethesda to model every single piece of the Dwarven automaton. So this boiler is likely among the metal scrap that we find, together with all the other things needed to have it steam powered, like small pipes, pistons, automated valves and conduits. Because all these components are needed at the very least to animate the thing using steam. Now, since it's the most common automaton that we find, I'll try to explain basically how a Dwarven spider could work. In order to do so, it's necessary to understand how a steam engine works. Now, the simplest type of steam engine relies on heating water, which creates steam, as you can see in the picture. Now, since the volume of steam is far greater than the volume of liquid water, it makes a piston rise if you allow for a moving piston, as it pushes the piston upward as the steam needs space to be in, since it has a higher volume than water. And then the piston gets pushed upwards due to the steam pressure. Then cold water cools down the steam again, turning it back into liquid with a smaller volume, thus creating a vacuum, since, you know, the piston has been pushed upwards, so there's more space there now than there was when it was all liquid water, which makes it so that atmospheric pressure from the outside pushes the piston back down. This schematic shows that. Now, we have found a lot of ways to make this system far more efficient, with condensers for example, but I won't bore you with explaining how steam engines work specifically, as especially the more modern variations are too hard for even me to understand. But what you do need to know is that steam engines are kind of limited by the strength of the metal that they are constructed from, as they need to be able to handle the steam pressures, as some strength is needed to contain the pressure as it builds inside the cylinder and inside the boiler. And I also understood that steam engines generally produce an up and down movement. Now, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'll pin a comment if that's the case. Anyway, steam engines make this up and down movement as they rely on the concept of boiling water to produce steam to push something up using a cylinder, and then generated outside pressure to push that piston down again. Now, through mechanic couplings, this kind of movement can be utilized to, for example, spin a wheel or a gear, as you know. Since when you have something which moves up and down, we can convert that movement to a spinning movement through some mechanical couplings. But from what I understood, using one steam engine to power all the legs of a Dwarven spider and the arms of a Dwarven spider independently from one another is very impractical from what I've been told, as you would require countless miniature gearboxes working independently from one another to regulate spinning speed for each of the legs and each of the arms. This means that inside a Dwarven spider alone there's either one small, strong central steam engine connected to a gearbox for each of the spider legs and each of the arms, or they need to have several small-scale cylinders for each leg, reliant on one small central boiler providing steam for all the engines, a system which is not impossible but definitely intricate and still requires some coordinating for the movements. But again, I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I really wouldn't know how to make this using steam. There are several solutions to this problem as far as I've understood. The first one, as I said, is one strong engine with a central boiler connected to a sort of shaft, which in turn connects to several gearboxes which control the rotation speed of each arm and each leg independently. The second solution is 8 small steam cylinders drawing steam from the central boiler for the legs and the arms of the spider, each with their own condenser. In each case they use steam engines which are extremely small, and in the case of some automatons they can produce quite some power to hold the automatons upright and to move them. This means that their extremely unbreakable metal alloy, so the Dwarven metal, likely allows them to make very small steam engines which could handle large pressures inside the cylinder and inside the boiler, as they do not work with the same limitations that we have to work with, as their metal can handle more pressure, as the fact that our metal cannot handle a lot of pressure makes it so that our steam engines are always a little bit limited, since they need to be able to handle the steam pressure. But if the Dwemer have some sort of metal which can handle high pressures of steam when they have really thin metal for really small engines, then these kind of things could work. So I'm just proposing that as the solution for that, because that's what I got after reading a lot of pages. But of course you do need to remember that it's quite likely that since it's just a fantasy game with magic, that it's straight up very possible that Dwemer had some kind of steam engine which is either not discovered in the real world or does not work in the real world, as it's made with magic and it's simply a fantasy game, but still, it's fun to speculate. But what we do know for sure is that each automaton has a boiler and works with steam engines and cylinders in some way. And that this thing goes for each of the automatons, so each automaton works on steam. The exact mechanical workings of each automaton is different and is fully up to speculation, like the spider, because what I just said about all the steam engines is wholly speculation, but just accepting it works through steam still leaves some questions unanswered, even if we agree on the fact that a complete blueprint cannot be presented of these things. Like, for example, how is the boiler heated, and is there even water in the boiler? Because, you know, to generate steam, you need to heat the water in the boiler. Well, the speculation of most people online and myself is that the soul gem in the automaton heats the water using magic. Now, we know that soul gems can be used to make traps which cast spells, like, for example, lightning bolts, independently from a mage, as we can find those kind of traps in ruins. So if the soul gem that we find in the automatons produce a little heat, they can heat up the boiler and create the steam needed. The problem here is then how it's possible for these automatons to still be around after so many years. How is the soul gem not empty like the soul gems that cast a spell in the traps, if the automaton has basically been functioning for so long after the Dwemer's disappearance? Well, there's a semi-canon solution to that, but before that I will talk about something else, as I also would like to propose that it's possible that in the boiler there isn't water, but some sort of other liquid which evaporates, so turns into steam, at lower temperatures than water, so requiring less energy from the soul gem to be heated by having another liquid. This could make the soul gem last longer and thus maybe need less frequent recharging of the soul gem, but in that case we would still have the problem that the boilers need to be filled, as steam and vapors escape the automatons visibly when we see them. This means that the boiler does need to be refilled at some point as the liquid escapes the system. Water is an easy liquid to fill, as almost every Dwemer city would have a water system which would make autonomous refills by the automatons possible, and you know, the water could then come from rivers and streams, which goes into pipes into the Dwemer cities. But if there's another liquid in there, like for example forms of alcohol which evaporate with less heat than water, then the Dwemer would need to keep reserves of these liquids, and those reserves would have to be big enough for the automatons to use them for the past thousands of years. So I personally think that water is an easier solution to this, but it's possible for the Dwemer to have created all sorts of processes to automate, you know, the generation of this other liquid which they may use. I mean, just keep the option in mind, as it could lower the energy consumption of the overall system and thus make the soul gem last longer if it's another liquid than water, but, you know, we don't know. Now, let's get to how the soul gems could recharge, and as I said, we have a semi-canon source for this. You see, there was a post on the old Bethesda forums of one of the Morrowind writers, which is now deleted, so can't be read anymore, but fortunately it's preserved in summary status by the user Narintin 10 years ago on Reddit, but be warned, since the original post, which was already dubious in its canonicity, is lost, and I had to take this from someone who summarized it 10 years ago now, I don't know how accurate it is, but it's the only real explanation we have that's secondhand from one of the developers, as it's someone's interpretation of what one of the developers wrote. We know that that article on the Bethesda forums existed, that it was written by one of the Morrowind writers at the time. We just know that it disappeared and I haven't been able to find it, so I had to do with this summary. Well, according to this post, supposedly by one of the Morrowind writers, the Dwemer wanted to alter souls in a way to strip souls of their individuality and merge them with other souls in order to create a soul of a higher order with the power of more souls in it. Essentially, the Dwemer would have seen creation, so the creation of existence, as the shattering of a higher soul into many individual, smaller souls. This would have been one of the ways that they would have sought for the divine, which they were obsessed with, as by trying to create this higher soul out of smaller souls, they in their minds reversed creation. They called this anti-creation, as the shattering of a large soul is reversed and smaller souls are merged again. But the Dwemer weren't gods, so these created higher souls were imperfect and often unstable, and thus fell apart in countless tiny soul fragments after a while, fragments even smaller than the souls of mortals. Now, the Dwemer had an interesting outlook on this, since their souls were subservient to the gods, since their own mortal souls were created from a higher soul. These tiny soul fragments, as their previous individuality was stripped and made into one higher whole by the Dwemer before falling apart, were in their minds subservient to them instead of the gods, as these souls, shattered and stripped of their individuality, could no longer escape to Aetherius, but rather kept orbiting the Dwemer cities where they were created, thus creating a sort of complex where the Dwemer would see these souls as subservient and lesser than their own souls. But what happened to these soul fragments? Well, this post allegedly told us that the souls could not escape back to Aetherius as they were stripped of their individual, and essentially these soul fragments were incompatible with leaving Mundus the regular way, so these soul fragments just orbited their place of creation, which was the Dwemer cities. The post would then go on to say that these little souls would periodically enter and recharge the soul gems of automatons. Then when their powers expanded, they leave the soul gem again and are replaced by another soul fragment. But the soul fragment which exited the soul gem is apparently unable to exit Mundus, so instead of exiting Mundus, they keep orbiting around the Dwemer city, where they siphon off magicka from the air around the Dwemer cities, which enters Mundus through the sun. They recharge, and then they go into the automaton's soul gem again, leaving a perpetual cycle of charge the automaton, unable to leave Mundus, charge the soul fragment in the air, then start over the cycle. One interesting thing that the author of this summary stated is that the other name of Dwemer Automatons is Anemonculi, which is the plural form of Anemonculos, which may be derived from the two Latin words anima and modicum, which translates to little soul from Latin, so yeah. I don't speak Latin, but with that possible information, you can just do what you want. So, while this explanation is a little shaky, it is the closest to canon-ish that we have of an explanation, and it will stand until we have a definitive answer from a completely canon source. But there is some evidence for this, because in Morrowind it stated that when automatons leave the cities, they can continue to function a little bit, but eventually they shut down. Because inside the cities they can, continue to function indefinitely, but after a while, when taken outside of the cities, or rather, it's worded as too far from the cities, they will stop functioning after a while, indicating that they have to refuel in the city somehow, or by the city somehow. And the fact that they word it as too far instead of outside likely means that it has something to do with the specific area of the city. So the fragmented souls theories, which says that around the cities there are orbiting little soul fragments which recharge them, that could stand, but in all fairness it could also mean that something in the city, like a resonator or something, controls the automatons, as it's suggested that the Dwemer used to control the automatons through sound magic, or tonal magic as it's called, and that if you want to control them today you even need control rods which allegedly also use sound, so tonal magic for their control. So it's possible that the fact that they're controlled from inside the city using a control tower or resonator, some forms of which we can actually see in the Elder Scrolls Online, Dwemer resonators, so we know that they use them for some purposes. It might be that that causes the shutdown if they get too far from that in the city, so, take with that what you want, do with that information that you want. But I still think that the loss of power when the soul gem is empty can likely be the main cause for the shutdown, as we know that the dwarven centurions and larger automatons can actually function away from the city, as they have their own dynamo core, which generates energy and apparently can seemingly function as an independent power source for some time, as they're outside the cities, as these automatons were made to also function outside of the cities. So that's why I think that the soul gem theory and the fragmented souls theory has some basis and might actually be a decent explanation, which is why I included it in this video, even though I had to get it second hand as the original post is no longer on. But that's about all that we can say and speculate about Dwemer Automatons. Next up, let's talk about a creature that I often feared facing in Skyrim as well, the Wispmother. There are subjects that cause heavy debate among even the most renowned scientists, subjects that nobody really understands, and the smartest minds of our world cannot come up with a consensus as to how to explain these subjects.
In the Elder Scrolls universe, one of these subjects is Wispmothers. Nobody really seems to truly understand these creatures, and many scholars over the years have debated their origin, function, and whether they even exist, because no scholar has ever seen a Wispmother or survived seeing one, as it's one of the most dangerous creatures, and only the most hardened warriors and mages can hope to even survive an ordeal with one of these creatures. Scholars trying to research the Wispmothers usually have to use second-hand accounts by warriors and travelers, and this has made the knowledge on Wispmothers one of the most fascinating debates on Tamriel. One of the few things that mostly everyone agrees on is that Wispmothers are strange, almost spectral-like women, clothed in mist and some connection to being undead. And they use wisps to lure travelers to them and then kill them, to steal their energy. But other than that basic description, the knowledge on them is very disputed. The theories about the origin of Wispmothers are all very different and can be separated into two categories. First, there are the folktales and legends, and second, there are the theories by academics. Let's start with the folktales. A lot of people tend to believe that the Wispmothers are just powerful ghosts that couldn't find rest. These people also tend to believe that the wisps the Wispmothers control are the spirits of the previous victims who had become enslaved to the Wispmother that she killed. Others believe that the Wispmothers are remains of powerful snow elf witches who were killed during the war with Ysgramor and his Nord armies and found a way to persist. This theory of them being snow elves would seem very cool and interesting at first, and even has some merit to it, judging by Skyrim, as when we compare, for example, the looks of Galawar and Verther, the two snow elves still in their uncorrupted state, we find a striking resemblance with the outward appearance of the Wispmothers, without the whole cloaks and mist. In addition to that, the special named Wispmother, the Pale Lady we can find in Skyrim, has been named in lore as a mysterious figure named Amriel, an elven name, and has been described as fighting Ysgramor's heirs for decades as a Wispmother. So there is some significant merit to this theory of them being the remains of snow elves. However, since Elder Scrolls Online and Elder Scrolls Blades, they have shown that Wispmothers exist in other places around Tamriel than Skyrim. This argument then gets a bit weaker, as snow elves never really ventured all too far away from Skyrim as far as we know. However, it might be possible that some Wispmothers are the remains of snow elves, as Sadran Serethi, an expert on Aelid culture and First Era history, argues that Wispmothers are probably the result of a special type of lichdom that was discovered in the First Era by some witch tribe. He theorizes that most Wispmothers came from a powerful clan of witches who discovered this way of lichdom to attain eternal life through being undead. So it's possible that this clan might have had some snow elf members, which would explain the story of Amriel and would explain why Wispmothers exist all over Tamriel. Serethi also argues that the accompanying wisps are probably powerful conjurations by the Wispmothers, and that they are under her full control and that they cannot live without her sustaining them. This theory is the theory that I probably personally believe, as this would link up with the folktales that we know about them, and also this clan would have discovered this type of lichdom back in the First Era when there were still snow elves, and they might have had lots of snow elf members, which would explain the folktales and, for example, explain the Pale Lady. Alternatively, Synod researchers think that the Wispmothers are not a type of undead. Rather, they argue that there are elemental manifestations rising out of Nirn itself, a bit like Spriggans and Ice Wraiths. Lindet Villain of the Synod argues that they are essentially the elemental personification of snow and mist, wielding those elements naturally instead of being an undead who manipulates it through sorcery. She also argues that the wisps accompanying the Wispmother are almost literally her children, making her truly a Wisp mother. She says that these are probably subspecies that lure the victims to her and then share in the energy that the Wispmother steals from her victims. So these are basically the major visions on wisps and Wispmothers. Which exactly is true, we don't know. Maybe neither is true, as we don't learn much about the mysterious Wispmothers, and there isn't really much lore to them. It just seems like Bethesda just kind of created them as enemies and then was like, yeah, let's write a couple of things on them, but not more, because this was literally all the lore I could find on them. That said, it's time to talk about the next creature, which is going to be very similar to the Wispmother in terms of the amount of lore that we have, the Ice Wraiths. Ice Wraiths are one of those enemies that made their first appearance in the Elder Scrolls series by the time of Skyrim. However, they've existed in lore for far longer, as the first edition of the Pocket Guide to the Empire makes mention of them in the Skyrim section. In this section it stated that young Nords go out into the mountains for weeks on end to hunt the mighty Ice Wraiths. They do this to be recognized by their communities as worthy members of the community, and become worthy citizens of Skyrim. It's even mentioned in the making of Skyrim that The Ice Wraiths was one of the first enemies that they thought of, since it was one of the first enemies of Skyrim that they knew of in lore, and that they had to imagine in a certain way. As the only piece of lore prior to Skyrim of the Ice Wraiths was that young Nords would go into the mountains to fight them. We don't really see this phenomenon happening anywhere in Skyrim, except for when you join the Stormcloaks, when Gelmar wants you to prove yourself as a hardened warrior by defeating an Ice Wraith. He tells you that this is how many men have tested their mettle for ages, meaning that this custom is still being practiced to this day. A fact which is also backed up by a conversation with Maurice Aravel, a Dwemer merchant. Understandably, many people don't really have a struggle with this test, as long as you have some skill. As in the Herbane's bestiarity, Ice Wraiths are basically described as quite simple-minded creatures that are fast, but that aren't too smart, and some technique combined with brute force and a good weapon would be enough to fell one of the beasts. The author even mocks the more Nordic tradition of fighting the Ice Wraiths by boasting how he defeated 2 of them with general ease himself. But it doesn't really matter how easy to defeat they are, what we care about is what they are. The bestiary describes them as lucid serpentine creatures consisting of magic that seem to be conjured from Skyrim's frozen land itself. This is mostly confirmed by Synod researcher Lynette Verlaine, who states that Ice Wraiths are just elemental manifestations that arise out of Nirn, that innately wield the power of their elements, in this case ice, as they are Ice Wraiths. This also makes sense because Ice Wraiths have the unique ability to hide in the ice and snow by more or less fusing with it, making them invisible for a short while. However, because they are named Ice Wraiths, with Wraith being a synonym for ghost, some people have theorized that these creatures are in fact lost spirits who manage to get fused with the ice, or that they might be Daedric in origin, in the same way that people theorize that Spriggans are to be Daedric in origin. Especially that last theory has been made because of their similarities to Spriggans. They wield the power of their element, and they tend to lurk around and protect significant places. Other than serving as an initiation ritual for young Nords, the Ice Wraiths are also very attractive to both alchemists and people dealing with fresh products, because when you grind up fresh Ice Wraith teeth, it can be used as an extremely powerful preservative ingredient that can keep vegetables and meat cold for a limited time. However, I don't know how prevalent this thing is across Tamriel, as it seems to be a relative butcher's secret, so it might only be known to a few butchers and traders. Next to that, the teeth of Ice Wraith are also very powerful as an alchemical ingredient that's quite rare to come by, because of the method to obtain them, because it includes slaying the beasts themselves. And finally, the thing that we know is that an encounter with them can get you Witbane, a disease which can lead to memory loss and can lead to intelligence being lowered. And that's about all that we know about Ice Wraiths. Next up, let's talk about the Hagraven. So, Hagravens. Most of us have encountered them at least once or twice during our playthroughs of Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls Online. But not many know the story behind the Hagravens, and most likely that's because we don't know a whole lot about them actually. Very basically, a Hagraven is a witch that craved power so much that she was willing to surrender her humanity and physical appearance in exchange for greater magical powers. A mere husk of humanity and a deformed human body fused with the body of a raven. The resulting creature is a very strong creature in the black magic arts, and contrary to popular belief, retains the intelligence and cunning that it had before the transformations. Although it's rumored that the Hagraven transformations also transforms a witch's emotions and drains much of the good aspects of their personality and emphasizes the bad aspects. Personality traits like jealousy, possessiveness and sadistic tendencies get stronger, while compassion gets weaker, for example. Although we don't know if these were traits that the witch already has and haven't been emphasized, they just were retained, while the good aspects were drained away. We don't know exactly how that works, but you can get the picture. Another thing that seems to come with the transformation is a sort of worry and jealousy about their own beauty and appearance. While they have completely surrendered that in the ritual, it's something that a lot of Hagravens seem to be concerned about. Hagravens themselves are actually quite rare, as the witches who choose to transform themselves must already be quite powerful, and witches on that level of power aren't super common, and most witches would not want to undergo the transformation. Therefore, the sight of Hagravens is quite rare. They do technically occur over all of Tamriel, as the appeal of the transformations is universal, but the highest concentration of Hagravens exists in and around the Reach, as within the Reach there's the Reachmen and they are venerated by the Reachmen.
The Reachmen, or Sorn as they call themselves in Skyrim, worship these creatures. Often this worship complex leads into a situation where the clans are led by Hagravens. In some clans it's even customary to be led by a witch who works towards becoming a Hagraven, and then when the next Hagraven dies, then another witch will go into training to become a Hagraven and then lead the clan again. We don't know much about this transformation ritual itself, and when I say not much, I almost literally mean nothing. It's been suggested by a lot of people online that the transformation is somehow linked to the Daedric Prince Nocturnal, but there's no in-game evidence that I could find for this, unfortunately. We do know, however, that the ritual gives their bodies not only much more magical potential, but also transforms and transmutes certain aspects. Like, for example, the hands get claws, and those claws themselves have highly magical properties, as do the feathers that start growing on their bodies after the transformation. These are both ingredients that can be used in alchemy, and it's suspected that more aspects of their bodies also get highly magical properties, but we simply don't really know about the transformation details or the details of their body after the transformation. As I iterated before, these transformations can be very useful for witches seeking great power and that are willing to pay any price and surrender their humanity. As such, it's not like Hagravens are united in any clan or anything, as witches just undergo the transformation individually. Many different witches have sought out the transformation over history. For example, some witches of the Glenmoril clan have undergone the transformations, as we can see in Skyrim, and undoubtedly many other clans have done the same, and many individual witches have done the same. As such, the customs of Hagravens are very different. They vary per individual. While most of them are vile and sadistic, jealous creatures, they all are different individuals and have different habits. It's suggested that some Hagravens and Hagraven clans, for example, eat human and elvish meat, so are essentially cannibals, while others don't. And some also worship Daedric princes and have their cults sort of in service for Daedric princes like Namira or Hircine, while others don't and just are in the game for the power, so to say. Now, a final thing to note about Hagravens is that we have this book in the Elder Scrolls Online which describes the author of the book being a slave to a Reachman clan, which was being led by a Hagraven. This Hagraven apparently had a husband and a son. Now, the husband was a powerful necromancer, which makes some amount of sense, as he's just there for the sort of power couple, so to say, and not really there for, you know, the personality of his wife or the looks. Like, I don't want to be objectivist, but Hagravens look pretty awful. But the fact that there was a son is pretty strange to me, as I would personally assume that when they surrendered their humanity, they would have also become infertile. However, this doesn't necessarily have to be the truth, as within this book, the existence of a Hagraven's son is actually confirmed. But then we have to take into account that it's possible that this son was born before the transformation, when she was still a witch. If that's the case, it means that the Hagravens might still be infertile, but the book does not really answer the question, as it doesn't really address whether the son was born before or after the transformation, meaning that it's still unknown whether Hagravens also surrendered their reproductive capabilities in the ritual.
And that is about all that we know about Hagravens. Next up, let's talk about a couple of creatures that are present in the lore about Skyrim, yet are not present in the game for whatever reason. And first, let's talk about a creature that was featured prominently in one of the games that took us to Skyrim before the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the Gehenoth.
So, the Gehenoth. It's a creature which only appeared in a very obscure game of the Elder Scrolls series, the Elder Scrolls Travel's Dawnstar. In that game, the Gehenoth is a monster type which appears in the game and roams the snowy fields around the city of Dawnstar. It specifically hunts at night, targeting sleeping travelers, and as such is feared by the people of Dawnstar, who give travelers the advice to always run, as nobody except for exceptional mortals are able to defeat this monstrous creature. In Dawnstar, it functions as this sort of horror or terror beyond the walls that everybody fears. And I don't know, I just think that's kinda cool, because we don't see that often in Elder Scrolls games. They don't seem to hunt in packs and rather hunt alone, and they fight their enemies with melee attacks that can freeze their enemies as well. Now, we know that they do have quite a sizable population, as this enemy isn't rare per se or unique, as you can come across more of them after defeating them. And one exceptionally strong Gehenoth is the final boss of the game, which is the unique Gehenoth Trisborn, which has a more brownish set of scales and is by far the strongest enemy in that game. But here's the thing, that's about all the solid information that we have on the Gehenoth. You see, Bethesda just introduced it as one of their biggest predators of Skyrim. The people of Skyrim are absolutely terrified of encountering one at night, and on top of that, it has a pretty cool design, in my opinion. And yeah, it's just a big and threatening predator that has a really unique design, and then they just never use it again. But if you think this is where the video ends, you've clearly never watched my videos before, as, well, explaining away Bethesda's retcons is basically my day job at this point, and I would not be making this video if I didn't have some interesting speculations and additional lore to present to you guys. You see, the main story of the Elder Scrolls Dawnstar is really short, but they have you just explore a lot of pretty useless dungeons to pad the game. So in short, the story is that you, the hero of Dawnstar, arrive in the city of Dawnstar, which is being besieged by these mysterious snow people. Many people have assumed that these are the same people as the Ice Tribe, which we see in the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey, and many people in turn have speculated that these Ice Tribes may either be really early concepts for the Falmer that we see in Skyrim, or the Reeklings we see in Skyrim's Dragonborn expansion. I personally lean towards the explanation that they may be early designs for Reeklings, as they display some abilities to speak to the main races of Tamriel, something which the Falmer seem unable to do. This means that it's likely that these people of the Ice Tribe are early designs for the Reeklings, which are at the time of the Elder Scrolls Travels Dawnstar besieging the city. Now, they were able to do this because one of the city's 4 champions has betrayed the city, although the governor doesn't know which one, so, you know, it's up to you, the player, to find out. Long story short, you find out who the traitor is, which interestingly changes every playthrough. They made it replayable, which is kinda nice. And once you find out, the Reeklings or the Falmer attack en masse, as the traitorous champion tries one last ditch effort to get things turned in their favor. Now, during that attack, the special thrice-born Gehenoth is with them, having allied with the Ice Tribe, which are either Reeklings or Falmer. Now, this Gehenoth is the strongest creature in the entire game, and is likely an alpha of sorts in their population. This does show, however, that the Gehenoths likely have some capabilities of communication with its fellow invaders in the form of the Ice Tribes and the Trolls, which attacked the city at that point, because it was coordinating the attack with them. But this again shows that Gehenoths likely operate and hunt alone, because the thrice-born Gehenoth is the only Gehenoth with the invading army. So there's likely no social structure in their population. Now, likely this means also that the Gehenoths are alone for most of their life, unless they need to mate. We do not have an example of a female Gehenoth, and we don't know how they mate either. Anyway, the real question is, why was this enemy never used again, what happened to it, and where did it come from? Well, as I said, we have covered now basically everything that we can deduct from the actual lore, but there are a few theories in that regard. Now, one theory that I've read a couple of times online, even though I couldn't find a single shred of evidence for it, is that the Gehenoth may have been a result of either Dwemer or ancient Falmer, so the Snow Elves, magical experimentations on trolls. Now, this theory goes that when the Falmer and the Dwemer were at war with the Nords, they quickly realized that they were losing out and just tried to create something even stronger than a troll to fight the Nords for them. Now, if this is the case, it's most logical for the Snow Elves to be the one to have done all the experimentation, as the Dwemer could have just built another battle robot. This theory would explain why the Gehenoth would be willing to help the Ice Tribe if the Ice Tribe are indeed an early design of the Falmer that we see in Skyrim, as it would explain why it's with them, or even want to protect them in some way. Now, a second theory is that they are related to the Grawl, or Ice Giants of Solstheim, which we saw in both the Blood Moon expansion for Morrowind and more recently in the Elder Scrolls Legends as Card. Now, this theory goes that the Gehenoths are an offshoot of a couple of Grawl that made it to the mainland and then evolved from them to become their own population. Combining this theory with the previous theory, it could also be that the Gehenoth is a result of Snow Elf experimentations on the Grawl, because we know that the Snow Elves also made it to Solstheim. Now, honestly, we just don't know, there's no lore on it, but I found these explanations to be interesting. But the most intriguing theory to me personally is that the Ice Tribe may not be Reeklings or Falmer at all, but rather Akaviri Kamal, which is known to house a race of snow demons. So the Ice Tribe could have been the foot soldiers of that nation, and the Gehenoth their infamous snow demons, because these things are definitely demon-like. Now, the idea is that these Ice Tribe and these demons are descendants of the Kamal invasion of Tamriel in the Second Era. Now, the only problem with that theory is that in the Elder Scrolls Online, we only play a few years after the Kamal invasion of Tamriel, and there are no Kamal to be found, and the Elder Scrolls Travels Dawnstar takes place in the Third Era, hundreds of years after their invasion, and also hundreds of years after their last mention in Tamrielic history, several hundred years after the Elder Scrolls Online. There were some remnant Kamal which joined up with the remaining Saci on Tamriel to try and become Cyrodiil's rulers. That failed, and after that we never heard of them anymore. So to think that suddenly, hundreds of years later, they have enough numbers to besiege a city after they disappeared from Tamriel and its history seems unlikely. So to me, the first theory seems far more likely, where the Gehenoths are failed experiments on trolls and then became their own population in the wilds of northern Skyrim, just feared immensely by the population. And honestly, we just have no idea why they disappeared either, or why there aren't any in the Elder Scrolls Online. Now, the only outcome for that mystery would be if they are perhaps the result of local sorcerers' more recent experiments on trolls or grolls somewhere in the 3rd era. So a couple of years before the events of the Elder Scrolls Travel's Dawnstar. It's possible that this sorcerer then just lost control of his creation and maybe they escaped from his lab and eventually got killed off by adventurers or soldiers after a few decades, after their population just shrank, after adventurers or soldiers sought them out to just prove themselves or clear them out. Which could explain why they are no longer there in the 4th era, but honestly, the Gehenoth is probably just something Bethesda forgot, but that's a shame, as I would have no idea why Bethesda never reused this awesome creature. Do let me know though, what you thought of the Gehenoth. Would you like to see it back in the future? I mean, I would. I don't know, it's a kind of disgusting creature when you look at the sprite, but it's also kind of cool, and just the fact that it's kind of this horror-ish scare beyond the walls. I don't know, that would have added something cool to Skyrim, and that's why I wanted to tell this story in this video today.
But that is about all that we know about the Gehenoth and can speculate on. Next up, let's talk about another creature which is definitely present in the lore, but for some reason doesn't feature in the game. At least in Skyrim, because we do see them in the Elder Scrolls Online. The Sea Giants. So, the Sea Giant, a presumed distant cousin of Skyrim's regular giant, is a curious case. For one, they are much more intelligent than Skyrim's regular giants, as they are able to master multiple languages next to their own and are far more advanced craftsmen. While giants in Skyrim are quite primitive, the Sea Giants are able to build longships and create advanced tools, and they are even able to use a limited degree of magic. Further differences with their land cousins on Skyrim's tundras are that they have blue silvery skin and are even more resistant to the cold than regular giants. And unlike normal giants, Sea Giants are mostly creatures of legends, as not many have actually seen them during their lifetime. You see, Sea Giants, as their name suggests, live on longboats in the Sea of Ghosts for most of the year, and they very rarely make landfall on Tamriel. Only once every few years, small contingents of Sea Giants will make land on Tamriel, and it's even rarer for large groups to make landfall. When they do make landfall, it's often during very cold winters that even they cannot weather, and they often raid Nordic coastal villages if they come en masse, which they have done a few times. And if they come with really big groups, they often raid bigger cities on the northern coasts like Solitude, Dawnstar and Winterhold. Although that happens so rarely that most Nords don't even tend to believe in the Sea Giants' existence, and see them as creatures of legends and fairy tales which do not actually exist and are just, present in stories to scare children. But they very much do exist, as like I said, they have raided Skyrim's northern coast semi-regularly during its history, and in the lore that we have it says that the legends of Sea Giants on Tamriel's northern coasts started around the middle of the First Era, which actually provides somewhat of a hint of where they could live, but I'll get to that in a bit, because you see, the sources that we have, which are all written by Tamrielic peoples by the way, tell us that Sea Giants live on their gigantic longboats all year around and do not make landfall unless it's so cold that even they cannot go on sailing and the sea freezes around them. The people of Tamriel presume that the Sea Giants on their ships, which they allegedly live on all year round, feed themselves by hunting the whales of the Northern Sea, and the extreme cold of the Northern Sea of Ghosts doesn't bother them that much because of their extreme cold resistance, meaning that as long as they keep themselves fed with whale meat and presumably are able to drink salt water, I guess they can keep themselves going indefinitely at sea. But I personally have a different theory based on some evidence, because considering that we know that the continent of Atmora, which froze over and became completely unlivable for regular humans, despite being the original home continent of most races of humans, that continent is in the north of the Sea of Ghosts, and that continent also allegedly had giants. And the story of Sea Giants started appearing for the first time in the middle of the First Era, when Atmora had semi-just frozen. There's a strong chance that their main population, so the main population of Sea Giants, lives on Atmora's coasts, being able to weather the cold due to their extreme cold resistance and being able to live off the fish that they catch near the coasts. This also means that they could get non-salt water by melting Atmora's land snow and ice, solving that problem. Another strong indicator of them living in a place which at least used to be inhabited by humans is that in their raiding parties they bring a lot, and I mean a lot, of half giants, which allegedly came about due to their breeding with humans. Considering how rare sightings of sea giants are on northern Skyrim, and thus not many Nords who have even seen them, and even less who would be able to breed with them, and even less who would have wanted that, it would make sense that these half-giants, which seem to have inherited the cold resistance of the actual sea giants, are probably the long-time descendants of those humans who on Atmora breeded with these giants, leading to the half-sea giants long before Atmora froze over. Or perhaps just as Atmora was freezing over, just, you know, to give their own descendants a chance. But again, it all makes sense to me, but that's my speculation, since the only actual lore that we have is that they live all year round on their longboats. But that doesn't really make much sense to me personally, if only because of the salt water thing. So yeah, it's likely that they may live on Atmora, or at least what's left of Atmora, and likely then on Atmora's coast, considering that they mostly feed themselves with whales, and nothing grows anymore on frozen Atmora. That being said, due to their seafaring nature, they do spend a lot of time at sea and on the coasts. This can also be seen in their tools and in their clothes, as much of it is made with whalebone, horker hides, whale skin, and the large scales of a weird and unidentified sea creature that they seem to catch, although nobody on Tamriel seems to know what kind of creature those scales are on. But to get an idea, maybe watch my video on Tamriel's sea monsters for an idea of what kind of creature that possibly could be. But more importantly, their tools, being mostly made out of materials gathered while hunting out at sea, shows that they have very little land resources to work with. In fact, when they raid Skyrim's most northern villages, they seem to rarely take any valuables. They mostly take wood, metal and other building materials that are probably really hard to come by wherever they live when they are off their ships, be it just the high seas on their ships all the time or at Mora like I speculated. Because they need these materials to maintain their longboats, as repairing your boat with whalebone might not be the best material to keep them floating. Now, considering that they also attack Nordic ships when they encounter them on the Sea of Ghosts, because Nordic sailors say that if you are a witness to seeing a sea giant, you won't survive to tell the tale, it's likely that they also repurpose the materials of enemy ships that they, destroy to repair their own ships, trying to be as creative as they can with the little materials that they have. Strangely enough, it's even said that their weapons, especially harpoons, which are made out of whalebone, are of quite high quality, and that according to some on Tamriel, they are of better quality and they are lighter than some metal weapons on Tamriel, which is a pretty cool lore tidbit. Now it also seems that they are organized relatively primitively. They have chiefs, so they mostly likely live in really small communities like the orcs, although they also have titles like captain when on the high seas, so they might be more organized. We don't really know anything about the organization of their culture other than that the half-giants do seem to be always subservient to the actual sea giants, as they are usually seen serving the sea giants rather than a sea giant serving a half-giant. So that's basically what we know about their culture. That being said, earlier in the video I spoke about their language, which I couldn't find much of in the lore resources in the game, but the UESP have actually compiled all the voice lines in their native language that we have, and they try to make sense of what their language is like. They discovered that their language shares some words with the language of regular giants, but is quite different overall, which actually makes sense considering how many generations these two distant cousin species have spent apart, if of course they are from Atmora. Now, we also know that during our playtime in the Elder Scrolls Online there are a few places where we can encounter them, suggesting that the year 582 of the Second Era, when Elder Scrolls Online takes place, is a pretty cold year. As expected, we can find them raiding some villages along the very northern coast. We don't really know whether or not the sea giants became extinct by later eras, because in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim we don't see them anywhere, but considering that in the lore they only make landfall on Tamriel once in a few decades, it's pretty likely that they are still around, but they just aren't there that year, and it's not a particularly cold year. That being said, that's basically all I can say about Skyrim's sea giants. Next up, let's talk about a very cool creature that I really wish was in the game, but again was fortunately added by ESO, so we know what they look like: the Chub Loons. Skyrim's, I called them penguins in my original video, but I've been told that the great auk that they're based on is not a penguin. No need to comment it, I know. So, the Chub Loon, a penguin-like creature which, according to the lore book The Mystery of the Chub Loon, quote-unquote, serves no purpose. But their story is a bit more interesting than you may think, because yes, just like penguins, they waddle around cutely, they dive into the oceans and swim there to get fishies, and just like penguins, on cold days they huddle together as a group to provide each other warmth. Very cute, but there's more to them than just they are cute penguins. For starters, these stub-legged flightless creatures live on the northern coast of Tamriel, with the standard Chub Loon with its black and white feathers and dark beak making its home on the rocky cliff coasts of northern High Rock and Skyrim. There are other variants of the Chub Loon which exist as pets for you to buy in the Elder Scrolls Online Crown Store, which both originate in the lore from the more southern parts of the High Rock coasts, although we do not encounter them in the game. These are the Hay Crown Chub Loon, which has the color scheme of an emperor penguin, just like with the little crown on its head, and the Fell Brown Chub Loon, which has brown feathers and a blue beak. Now these two variants are apparently extinct because we don't encounter them anywhere else in the game except for in the Crown Store as pets. Now, the more interesting and final variant of the Chub Loon to exist in the game is the Atmoran Chub Loon, which has all white feathers and a blue beak, which is perfect camouflage for the icy tundras of Atmora. And this variant of Chub Loon actually gives us somewhat of a hint as to their origins, as we learn from the book The Mystery of the Chub Loon that before the start of the Second Era there are no records of any Chub Loon existing on Tamriel, and that one day they just showed up in historical records as a species. And they apparently have come from the sea when they suddenly started to show up, likely having migrated from Atmora, which is the ancestral home of most of the human races and a continent currently experiencing an ice age of sorts, as it's been completely frozen over and no humans remain there. And perhaps that's why the Chub Loon also eventually migrated, as thousands of years after the humans migrated, perhaps it became even colder and the seas became so inhospitable that even the fish that the Chub Loon eats maybe might not survive there, which is maybe why the Chub Loon might have migrated to the south, to Tamriel, but that's just speculation on my part. But we do know that despite the Chub Loon being quite clumsy on land and literally unable to defend itself against, well, basically anything, it disrupts entire ecosystems, as in the sea it's one of the best fish hunters of the north, meaning that other species living from the ocean's fish suddenly had a lot less to eat when the Chub Loon suddenly shows up. This is why once a colony of Chub Loon establishes itself on the cliffs of a part of the coastline, for example the Horkers of Tamriel, despite being 1,000 times stronger than the Chub Loon, get forced out of the habitat as they have far less fish available to them to survive, as the Chub Loon managed to efficiently hunt down the fish that the Horkers might have otherwise eaten. And while a logical solution for the Horkers might be to just, start eating Chub Loon, that ain't happening, as the Chub Loon are far more agile in the water than Horkers and are just very hard to catch, and their nests are on high rocks and cliffs, meaning that the Horkers can hardly reach them. So the Horkers get supplanted in the ecosystem and are literally forced out to move to other coasts. Now, this does not mean that nothing can hunt the Chub Loon, because they are very clumsy, because the orcs of northern High Rock have been hunting these creatures basically since they arrived, as they discovered that their grilled meat tastes really good with some moon sugar glaze and citrus. And here we have an example of them being not that smart and a bit clumsy, because while after some years they finally caught on to the fact that the orcs of Orsinium hunt them for their delicious meat, they don't run from any humans, Khajiit or Argonians or any other elves than the orcs for that matter apparently. And they just allow themselves to be picked up and petted because they don't see humans or any humanoids as a threat, except for the orcs, which they started to see as a threat after years of being hunted by them. And thus hunting them for other races than the orcs is really easy, because by now they finally flee for orcs when they see or smell one, but the other races they don't really care about. Now, we don't really know much more about these creatures, as I covered basically all the stated lore that we have on them, but there is some more information we should cover. Because first of all, there is a legend about Chub Loons in the lore, that they were once massive creatures, almost twice as big as human warriors. Back in the Meridic era on Atmora, that's basically when this whole massive stage of these creatures apparently took place, mighty warriors like Ysgramor wrestled these things as a challenge apparently, which could take a whole day to subdue one of the Chub Loon for even the mightiest of warriors. That's probably just a legend and an exaggerated children's story, which probably originates from like warriors wrestling with some other mighty creature at the coast, and then the story became distorted and the Chub Loon somehow became involved over the years of oral storytelling. But still, it's an interesting story. And second, we don't really know what happened to them, because by the time of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, there are no more Chub Loon on the coast. We don't know why. Perhaps the Nords also caught on to them being really delicious and just hunted them all down. Or perhaps, just like they migrated from Atmora to Tamriel, the Chub Loon once again mass migrated away, perhaps back to Atmora, as maybe by the time of Skyrim the continent has become habitable again for fish. and thus the Chub Loon, as their source of food, is back. But considering that they're heavily based on the real-life Great Auk penguin, which is extinct in real world, I think they are extinct by now, because that's what they were inspired by. But it's also possible that they are not extinct and that the creators simply picked this type of penguin as their inspiration, because not many would recognize this type of penguin as a regular penguin, and thus they would become a bit more distinct for the Elder Scrolls world. We don't actually know what kind of choices they made on that. But they are heavily based on this penguin type, with many of its mannerisms and its habitat being identical, so it's not a great stretch to think that many of the traits that we don't find in the lore in the Elder Scrolls for the Chub Loon, such as its procreation method, are simply the same as that of the Great Auk, because that's what it was inspired by. So if you for some reason want more headcanon lore on the Chub Loon, which is probably correct, check the Wikipedia page for the Great Auk, as it's basically the same creature. And again, by now, I know it's not an actual penguin, still very interesting creature. That having been said, that's basically all that we know about the Chub Loon. Next up, let's talk about a creature that was actually planned to appear in Skyrim, but just was removed during development. The Centaur. So, the Centaurs. They are creatures that appeared in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall and later appeared again as a playable card in the Elder Scrolls Legends, while being referenced in the lore in several of the other games. The Centaurs of Tamriel are very much like centaurs in other types of media, a tribal race of horsemen with a lower body of a horse and the torso of a man. They're an intelligent species with just as much, if not more, intelligence than the average mortal. In early concept art from Arena and Daggerfall, they very much look like traditional centaurs from other types of fantasy media, although in the more recent art from the Elder Scrolls Legends we can see that their looks have been a bit more refined. They now very much look like a more primitive kind of Bosmer with some orcish features for the torso and hair like traditional Nords, and of course a horse lower body. Their skin also seems to be covered in strange patterns, although those may also be tattoos, which could mean that tattoos may play a bit of a role in their society, but we don't really know anything about that since all we have on their tattoos is this one image. However, both this image and their appearance in Daggerfall and Arena and Daggerfall concept art shows that they are able to use a variety of weapons, from bows to spears to axes. Now, in terms of where they live, they mostly seem to live in Tamriel's forest, with them living in many different places. However, the biggest centaur population seems to be in Valenwood, where at their height several tribes lived a nomadic lifestyle across the Valenwood forests and jungles. According to some legends, they were there, in the forests of Tamriel, since the most ancient times, before the arrival of even the elves on Tamriel, when they came to Tamriel from Old Muris, with the elves likely encountering the centaur tribes in Tamriel's forests after their arrival. Over the years, their numbers have fluctuated a bit, with their tribes being quite numerous in the Merethic and First Era, but their numbers dwindling significantly over the years. Although by the Third Era we know that some tribes, or herds as some in the community call them, still exist. Now, we don't know all too much about their society, but we do know that they have their own quite complex language. They have a complex religion, which seems to be a combination of the Bosmer pantheon, with gods like Ifres and Auriel and Eos playing a role, while also worshipping their own direct ancestors seemingly. Interestingly enough though, some on Tamriel actually worship them, likely bringing the centaurs offerings and such in their worship, although we don't know exactly how that system of worship works, as we really only know that the centaurs are worshipped by some. Now, we do know that some on Tamriel are actually quite horny for centaurs and see them as a lust object, but I don't think that actually qualifies as worship. But anyway, what we do know is that some on Tamriel think that the centaurs might not really be a mortal species, but rather they might be forest spirits, much like Spriggans are. This might explain why they call the playable races mortals, suggesting that they might not be mortal themselves, which is very interesting and might explain some of the worship that they receive from mortals, as they might have strange magical powers or something like that we don't know much about. As beyond Daggerfall, they have not really been expanded upon all that much. They have been referenced and mentioned multiple times in the lore, but they've never been shown, except for one appearance as a card in the Elder Scrolls Legends. That said, they were supposed to play a far bigger role in both the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and in the Elder Scrolls Online, as both developer interviews and cut content data mines show us several things about how Bethesda envisioned their society and envisioned their usage in the games. For one, we know that in Skyrim they were supposed to nomadically trek around the province and hunt mammoths on the plains, leading to conflicts with the giants and the Centaurs, which would have been quite cool, but the idea was apparently never implemented due to time constraints, and apparently not even a model for the Centaurs had been made, meaning that it was likely scrapped quite early in development. Now, we also know that in the Elder Scrolls Online they were supposed to appear, as data mines show us that several classes of Centaur NPCs exist in the data, without models or anything, so also scrapped quite early, but we do know that they have several classes in the game and there were supposed to be some missions concerning the Centaurs. From this cut content we can find one pretty interesting thing, and that is that their nomadic tribes are apparently, in the cut content at least, led by females of their species, as they have a specific leader matriarch class, which is pretty interesting. Also, one of their few still existing mentions in the game is for the dungeon Elden Hollow, which is supposed to be a Centaur graveyard in the lore, and still is in the final game. Although in cut content, their bones, which are said to have alchemical properties, were supposed to play a far bigger role in that dungeon story, which is interesting but is also cut content. Now, it's a bit of a shame that in the final game they never appeared. There's some suggestion that the Elder Scrolls Online developers might have forgot about the Centaurs, although they are present in the data mines, so I don't know. That's why I haven't really speculated on where they are in the second era, as they seem to be cut for time constraints, just like the Imga. As both the Imga and the Centaurs seem to have been cut for time constraints, which is kind of a shame, and I hope that we'll see them in a future expansion or something like that, because in the lore they have been referenced since. And that is about all I can say about the Centaurs. Now, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this long compilation of videos, as right now we're at the end. Now, even though these were not all the creatures that you can find in Skyrim, as I simply haven't covered them all, and not all of them have a very deep story, unfortunately, I still hope that you learned something new about the creatures that you face every day in the game. Or the creatures that you miss facing in the game, with some of the creatures that are super interesting, but they just didn't implement for some reason. I might one day make a part 2, or even make one on Solstheim, as we haven't talked that much about creatures on Solstheim. But I think that for now, being 2 hours already, this is enough. Now, if you're still watching by now, let me know by putting in the comments what your favorite fruit is. I need some healthy diet variation, and it would really confuse other people in the comments if you tell me, and it would let me know that you watched all the way to the end, so hey, let me know in the comments what your favorite fruit is. That having been said, thank you so much for watching. It's a little bit of a hectic period right now as I'm ramping up for the 10-year anniversary of the channel. That's why we haven't had a normal lore video this weekend, but I promise good stuff's coming. See you later.